Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. In one of the larger updates this year, the Russians have managed to advance several areas across the eastern section of the front line. Within the Donetsk region itself, they've advanced about 20 plus square kilometers, but they also managed to advance within the Sumy region in the north. The Ukrainians managed to recapture a position that the Russians recently captured on the western bank of the Oskil River line. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within the town of Novoalexandrivka through the southern flank, where the Russians recently advanced through the month of April. The Russians have here managed to bypass the first line of defense of the Ukrainians by attacking from the southern flank. The Ukrainians are still present in the northeastern outskirts of the town, in the farm area. This means that the Russians will likely launch a combined assault from the southern and eastern flank, putting the Ukrainian positions in a pincer to gain control over the eastern parts of the town, and then gain control over the remaining parts, which will allow the Russians to start developing offensive operations on the northern bank of the Solona River through the residential area of Novoserhivka and the forest lines in the northern bank of the river line. The Russians have a difficult time proceeding beyond Novoalexandrivka towards the south or west, as long as the Ukrainians are present within Novoserhivka to the north. You see that the town of Novoserhivka has residential areas that goes all the way here to the eastern parts, and then there are separate residential areas further east in the forest lines along the river line. So the Russians would have a long road through the residential areas and forest lines along the river line before reaching Novoserhivka, following which fighting over the town can commence. The Russians will have a fire support from the southern bank of the river line, with FPV drones and their forces supporting a northern attack. This will also allow the Russians to secure the southern flank of Udashne beyond that of the fortified positions. The Russians will look to gain control over this area south of Udashne and attack it from the southern flank as well, expanding their supply lines into the town and the logistical situation there as well. The Russians will here develop their offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk border region and gain control over the remaining towns and the fortified positions in the area. There is this geolocated footage of Russian forces reaching the outskirts of Pokrovsk here in the southern parts of the city. The Ukrainians sent FPV drones to strike these positions. This geolocated footage made some already claim that the Russians made a major breakthrough, that they've gained control over the area up to the city. However, the situation is that some reconnaissance groups of the Russian army, just a few soldiers, managed to bypass the Ukrainian defenses in the area by moving through the forest lines and made it into the outskirts of the city, after which they were discovered beyond the Ukrainian lines, and after which it is very difficult for them to survive so deep into Ukrainian territories without necessary backup. Instead, what we can determine is that the Ukrainian defenses in the area, allowing Russian forces to pass through the defenses and reach the outskirts of the city, shows that the majority of their fighting capabilities remains in FPV drones and long-range strikes, and not so much in their defensive positions. We can also see an example here in the eastern parts, but we have to continue chronologically. The Russians managed to secure the southern bank of the Solona River here near Lysivka, leaving just a tiny bit of Lysivka remaining under Ukrainian control, of which as the Russians can attack from the southern and eastern directions to gain control over the remaining parts, where fighting will then continue on the northern bank of the Solona River. To the east, the Russians have made significant advances and a breakthrough towards the Ukrainian lines, gaining a foothold and partial control over the town of Novolenivka. The Russians also managed to attack the town of Yelisavetivka, gain control over the eastern parts of it, and flank it from the west, gain control over several fortified positions. The Russians also secured the southern parts of Myrolyubivka, the residential area of the town, and now held control over half of it. The Russians also managed to gain control over the intersection itself and managed to gain a foothold within the town of Melinivka. With secure control over the southern parts of Myrolyubivka, the Russians have a secure supply line to the central parts of the town and can start moving onto the northern parts and cross over into the western parts beyond that of Kasany-Torets River and into Mikhailivka. The Russians will here look to gain control over both sides of the rivers and his nearby fortified positions, and combine it with an attack from the Hrudivka direction to develop offensive operations along the Kasany-Torets River and up towards the highway, where they can connect with their forces from the east and start attacking Mirnorad from the eastern flank and continue the flanking maneuver beyond that of Pokrovsk itself, developing the eastern flanking maneuver in the Russian plan to encircle the city. With the capture of these fortified positions west of Yelizavetivka, the Ukrainian positions here are fairly isolated with a single road in and out of the western parts of the town. The Russians will likely gain control over the remaining parts over the next few days, following which the Russians will develop offensive operations along the fortified positions to reach the rear of Melinivka, supporting their push from the eastern direction. The Russians have a secure supply hub from the direction of Avdiivka and Donetsk all the way up to the intersection, from which the Russians can develop offensive operations both in the direction of Melinivka, in the eastern direction, and in the northern directions, where they'll develop offensive operations beyond that of the highway. With the push in the eastern directions, the Russians have secured the additional supply line towards Tarasivka from the western direction, and have developed offensive operations in several directions east of the town and north of it, where they've gained control over several roads up towards the town of Novolenivka and have managed to gain a foothold within the town. As is seen with this geolocated footage, there are several fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the western bank of the river line. The Russians can push through the highway to flank these fortified positions from the rear. This will allow them to fight over the fortified positions from both directions and also to flank them from their weak point while bombing them directly head on through the fighting near within the town. The Ukrainians have been shown to have some gaps in their defenses, which allows for significant Russian breakthroughs, such as this one, whenever the Russians detect them. This will allow the Russians to significantly weaken the Ukrainian supply lines and to exploit a gap in their defenses to make significant gains. This alone is an 11 square kilometer advance by itself. The Russians here are looking to gain control over Novopoltavka, which will then allow them to flank the fortified positions from the rear and advance along the main highway, where the Ukrainians do not have any positions except for the fortified ones. This means that FPV drone activity by the Ukrainians would be limited in the area compared to other sections of the front line, which will allow the Russians to strengthen offensive operations within the pocket itself, here west of Toretsk, east of the highway, and also to advance along the highway itself towards Yablonivka and Alexandro-Kalinove, here in the rear of these positions. It will significantly weaken and threaten the Ukrainian positions from Alexandropol in the west to Romanivka in the east, where the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces in the area can be encircled by the Russian forces. All of this is a result of a new offensive by the Russian forces on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk. This is to redirect the Ukrainian fighting capabilities from the western flank to the eastern flank and from other sectors to this eastern flank to contain it, which will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in other sectors of the front line to continue the envelopment of Pokrovsk, but also to continued offensive operations in the direction of Konstantinivka itself, where the Russians are aiming to start the battle over both Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka to gain control over both of these cities in the coming months. The Russians are looking to gain control over this entire area before moving onwards towards the flank of these fortified positions in the direction of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk further north, where the Russians will look to encircle those as well by capturing the rear positions of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian positions in the rear are also heavily populated. There's not a lot of industrial areas and there's not a lot of fortified positions, which makes it easier for the Russian forces to gain control over those areas compared to the heavily fortified areas in the east. It will also allow the Russians to cut off the supply lines of the Ukrainians going through the rear, which is fairly safe from Russian fire. And with additional offensive operations taking place in the direction of Liman to the north, the Russians will be able to completely encircle the Ukrainian groupings of forces from the Sloviansk to the Konstantinivka direction. Therefore, the Russians are launching two main pushes from the south, here through the eastern and western flanks of Pokrovsk to encircle the city and then move onwards, gain control over the rear of the Donetsk region of the Ukrainian forces, And at the same time, they are also launching offensive operations directly towards Konstantinivka, which is the southern flank of the Slovensk-Konstantinivka line. And at the same time, they're looking to gain control over Liman, as well as generally the eastern bank of the Uskut River line, which will allow them to cut off the supplies from the north as well. In the direction of Chesev Yar, there's a small advance by the Russians in the northern flank of the city. The Russians have been fighting over the forest patches and hills to the north of Chesev Yar for a while, as well as the residential area. There's no significant developments in the area, but the Russians managed to secure some of these areas over a long period of time, which has recently been reported on. The Russians also managed to secure the eastern parts of Vesyukivka, both from the south and from the east, gain control over the road between Sekoiv and Setit to Vesyukivka, and with additional advances to the south of Vesyukivka as well, they managed to cross over the river line, and fighting is taking place in the central parts of the town. The Russians are here developing offensive operations to the flank of Siversky in control over the town of Vesyukivka will allow the Russians to expand beyond towards Fedorivka along the main highway and in the western direction as well. This is to hit the supply lines of the Ukrainians in the Siversk direction for future offensive operations in the direction of the town. The Russians were spotted within the northern parts of Turske, close to the central parts of the town. However, the Russian forces and the motorcycles, in a similar case to what we saw earlier in the Sumy direction, the Russian forces were struck while they were launching this attack. It is clear that the Russians have had several opportunities to drive deeper within Ukrainian territory due to the gaps in the Ukrainian defenses, and this is yet another example of this. And this is why I believe if the Russians launch a larger offensive, the Ukrainians simply do not have the necessary capabilities to hold it back, and the Russian offensive will therefore be successful. In the eastern section of the front line, near the Uskut River line, the Ukrainians managed to launch a counterattack, securing Doroshivka from the gray zone and recapturing the town. The Ukrainians here are back to the outskirts of Zebhatne, where they continue working to regain control over the highway and cut off the supplies of the Russian forces in the direction of Melashevkivka and Gitirashivka, here in the direction of Kupiansk, which is yet another target of the Russian forces. The Russians are looking to gain control over Kupiansk, secure a bridgehead across the Uskut River line that is large enough for future offensive operations on a larger scale, and the eastern bank of the Uskut River line, as well as the Liman direction, so the northern bank of Siversky Donetsk River and the eastern bank of the Uskut River. This will allow the Russians to threaten Slovensk-Konstantinivka line from the north and Siversk from the north. In the direction of Sumy, the Russians have advanced both in the direction of Vladimirovka, gaining a foothold in the northern parts of the town, and the fighting is taking place over the central parts of it. At the same time, the Russians have also managed to advance within Bilovody, gaining control over the northern parts of the town and moving into the southern parts of it, where the fighting is taking place within the outskirts of the town from the southern direction, where the Russians are looking to kick out the remaining Ukrainian forces to gain full control over the town before moving onwards towards Yablunivka, which will allow them to flank Yunikivka from the rear, and in the direction of Vereshine to flank Novomikhailivka from the south. And this will allow the Russians to gain control over several towns along the border area before moving onwards towards Yunikivka, gaining control of which will create a buffer zone within the Sumy region for the Russian forces. Finally, there is this image here which shows the strike intensity across the front line. The blue-white strikes is low intensity until higher intensity, where the highest intensity is the red positions. As we can see, the frontline positions are with the highest strikes. Despite no movement in the Kharkiv region, there's still significant strikes there. The most intense strikes over this year has been in the Kursk region, as the Russians entered into the Sumy region, and in the eastern section of the front line from Zaporizhia in the south all the way to Kupiansk in the north. But there's also been some intense strikes in the Kherson direction. So based on this, we can see that all across the front line from the north to the south, there's been very intense strikes. These are mostly FPV drone strikes, but there's also been artillery strikes as well as missile strikes. As we can see, there have been strikes in Mariupol. There's been strikes deep into Ukrainian territories, both in the Kiev direction, Poltava direction, and so on. So based on this, we can see that There's heavy strikes all across the front line, even if there isn't much movement, and that is why the casualties of this war is very intense, despite the low speed of movement of the territory. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.